Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us for our annual Advocacy 101 training for private foundations. This event is intended to help private foundations specifically learn the rules and encourage you all to engage in the process. And as we get started this morning, I just wanted to acknowledge we understand how difficult the last year has been and how high the anxiety level is in our sector around how to engage without drawing negative attention or scrutiny. So we just want to acknowledge that as we go through while also not doing anything to discourage you from participating and using your voice. So we're hoping by the end of this training that you'll understand the rules and how to engage and do so while being in compliance. And we invite you to just sit back and relax, and we'll get you all the follow-up after the event. So our panelists this morning are folks that may be familiar to a lot of you. Carrie and Maggie have both helped us with this event before and are well known in the sector. Carrie Davis, who uses she, they pronouns, is the director of the Democracy program at the Joyce Foundation, where she leads the foundation's work to protect and improve policies on voting rights and voter access, election administration best practices, fair representation and redistricting, and promoting a more equitable US Census. Carrie also co-leads a pilot project addressing the rise of political violence and its harmful impact on functional democracy. And we're so glad they're here this morning. Maggie Heine is the Associate General Counsel at MacArthur Foundation. Prior to that, she served as the Associate Attorney at Ropes and Gray LLP, where she worked in the Tax, Employment, and Benefits Practice Group. Maggie is also a member of Forefront's Policy Committee, and I should mention that Carrie is also a former member of both the board and the policy committee at Forefront as well. So we appreciate so much their partnership and expertise this morning. On the next slide, we've got a quick snapshot of the agenda so you know what we're going to cover this morning. Lacey, you can go ahead and advance to the next slide, please. So as a reminder, you'll get a copy of all of this. And here's what we intend to cover this morning. We're going to go over the role of Forefront and as a PSO in public policy. And then Carrie and Maggie will cover the federal rules, and I'll touch quickly on the state and local rules. And then most importantly, we're going to dive into how to apply all of these rules and how you can engage in various ways while remaining in compliance. So finally, we'll go over election year considerations since we are in an election year, and that introduces some unique dynamics. And we'll be happy at the end to take as many questions as possible. You can also use chat along the way for questions. So please feel free to do that or raise your hand. We hope you will engage with us throughout the program. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Sebastian. And Sebastian is newer to Forefront's policy team. He joined us in September. And so we're so happy to have him on board. He and Lacey have been a huge asset to our organization, and we're so happy to have him. So Sebastian, take it away, and then he'll hand it directly to our panelists.
Good morning, everybody. I hope everyone has a good cup of coffee with them right now. I just joined Forefront's team's policy, as Holly mentioned, as their policy manager. We're going over Forefront grantmakers' role in some public policy. It'll be pretty brief and hand it off to our panelists today. So next slide, Lacey. So Forefront is both the philanthropic infrastructure organization and nonprofit alliance here in Illinois. So philanthropic infrastructure organizations or organizations like Forefront around the United States that support grant-making organizations of all shapes and sizes across Illinois. Part of the work of these organizations includes public policy, so that includes at Forefront, Holly, Lacey, and myself. In our case, at Forefront, we run a policy program on behalf of both grant makers and operating nonprofits across Illinois. And so we monitor state policy, and also at the federal level, we work closely with national partners like United Philanthropy Forum, National Council of Nonprofits, Council Foundations, and Independent Sector. We are also a part of other coalitions here in Illinois, including the Health and Human Services Coalition, the Protect Our Care Coalition, and other entities that work with us on state policy here in Illinois. But we also work with our national partners to trade notes on best practices and issues like tribal tax policy and government funding and contracting. So we regularly meet with folks from other states to see what they're working on and what we can also work on here in Illinois, and trade notes and ask questions to best inform policy here at the state level, but also sometimes federally as well. So at the state level, we have many partnerships I just went over right now. So again, Healthy Human Resources Coalition, Protect Our Care, folks like that. And policy is just really one aspect of what Forefront offers and does. For more information about Forefront, what we do for our members and for everyone else, we do have a virtual member orientation coming up, no obligation whatsoever. If folks are interested in seeing what our team does, meeting folks from our other units here at Forefront, and all that we offer to grant makers and nonprofits across the state. And then we also have, they used to be weekly member briefings gathered every other week, where we go over everything going on at the federal government, also state level here in Illinois, and sometimes local as well, so that folks are up to speed on what's happening in policy arena, and how it impacts our sector across the state. All right, next slide. So Forefront's role in public policy. We do have a policy board and a policy committee that we ensure we run our policy agendas through. So whenever we have new state legislation that we're trying to spearhead in Springfield or federal policies that we're monitoring in Washington, D.C. and Congress, we have a board that we ensure it oversees that legislation and provides feedback, as well as the policy committee. To make sure that folks are aware of what we're doing, and we're working on legislation that adequately and accurately impacts our sector and uplifts folks across the state. We also have a staff decision filter that helps ensure that the legislation we're working on and spearheading is timely, and also, again, best meets our partners and folks in the sector across the state. And lastly, we engage with our stakeholders through surveys and focus groups. We always engage with folks through communication, whether it's email, in person, to ensure that the policies we're working on are best reflective of folks and what they're seeing in their everyday profession. Next slide. So Forefront's role in public policy. So position statement, we defend democratic participation and civic engagement adamantly. So a core part of Forefront's commitment related to public policy is educating stakeholders about the rules of engagement and policy and advocacy at events like this one. So we really uphold this statement adamantly, and we defend democratic participation and civic engagement on a regular basis. The defense of democracy should be evergreen work. It should not only be once every so often in a decade. We talk about the census a lot at Forefront, something that we're working on right now. But this is an ongoing conversation. It's not something that we do, every 10 years. There's a whole ramp up to that process, and engaging folks and ensuring that we are adequately preparing for civic engagement with practices like the census, voting, and things like that. So the focus today with our panelists is to ensure that folks know how to engage in this process. And to learn more about our positions, you can visit our website, which we'll drop in the chat as well if folks are interested to see what we're working on in this area.
Thanks, Sebastian. And I lied. Instead of handing it directly to our panelists, I'm going to chime in for a couple more minutes. So bear with me, but soon they will be taking over. So we just wanted to kind of set the tone here a little bit and provide a little bit more context. So we understand that engagement in public policy and advocacy can understandably be tricky for private foundations, given all of the rules and restrictions. And so we also understand, like, sometimes specific organizations are led by boards of directors members or staff that don't agree on the substance of the issues we're facing today, or whether they should engage in the first place. And so we understand some of those challenges can be barriers to engagement in the public sphere. And so we're here today to really encourage folks to work through those challenges and figure out how to participate and to help improve your understanding of the rules and also the exceptions, which are important and offer protection in many cases, and how those apply to your work so that you can maneuver with confidence in the public sphere. And we understand no one can do everything, and there's a lot going on right now, but everyone can do something. And so we just want to encourage folks to participate boldly and with an eye on the rules we're about to cover. So on the next slide, we just want to convey why this is more important now than ever for a variety of reasons related to how the executive branch and Congress are maneuvering right now, specifically kind of against the charitable sector in some ways. And we know folks are concerned about that, and it's something we should all be keeping an eye on. So the executive branch has taken multiple actions that specifically target the charitable sector in the last year, and that includes an array of executive orders, threats of investigations against some foundations, especially large foundations, and of course, sudden contract cuts and cancellations that have affected many of the grantees that you all support. At least 32 of the executive orders dropped by this administration have a direct impact on the nonprofit sector, according to our partner, National Council of Nonprofits Executive Order Tracker, which is a helpful resource for those that need to dig in on any particular order. It also tracks related litigation. And those executive orders are disrupting federal support for diversity, equity, and inclusion, immigrant programs, LGBTQIA plus programs, gender affirming care, support for immigrant populations, environmental protections, climate change, implementation of the census, and voting and nonprofit advocacy rights. So there's a really broad array of ways that they're potentially restricting our freedom to act. So we'll share a few related links for those that need to dig in on executive orders. 30, I see Mary's question. Yes, according to the last time I checked, National Council of Nonprofits tracker, little Midwest Freudian slip there. It was about 32 executive orders that they're tracking that specifically target our sector.
Thank you.
So, yeah, no problem. As I said, please feel free to ask questions. So on the next slide, we've also wanted to point out a few things that Congress is doing to make sure folks are aware of that. So Lacey, if we could go to the next slide, please. So in terms of congressional actions, the main thing I want to draw attention to today is the conversation around fraud and domestic terror. So, and how Congress and other leaders are trying to link those two terms. So most recently, Vice President Vance announced a Department of Justice new Assistant Attorney General position that will be focused on investigating so-called fraud nationwide. But what makes it unusual is that that position will actually be run out of the White House instead of DOJ and report to the president and vice president. And so the intent is to have DOJ, through that position, investigate fraud and look into the so-called financing networks of those that are supporting what they define as domestic terrorism networks, which allegedly fund violent protests and so on. Vance's statements on that announcement referenced National Security Presidential Memorandum 7, which defined domestic terror as, quote, anti-Americanism, anti-capitalism, anti-Christianity, extremism on migration, race, gender, and hostility towards traditional American views. And then they define the latter term as, quote, resistance to traditional views on family, religion, and morality. So this kind of rings some alarm bells where the concern is that they'll target organizations that have ideological differences with the current administration in an unhelpful way. So our partners at the national level are really considering and tracking how to engage in litigation on this if and when it's needed. If, for example, if they were to go after without evidence specific criminal or civil investigations of specific nonprofits alleging that they're domestic terror organizations. And then secondly, they've reintroduced in Congress a new version of the former HR 9495, which I know some of you will remember from a couple of years ago. Forefront strongly opposes that legislation, which would amend the Internal Revenue Code by granting unilateral powers to Treasury to revoke an organization's tax-exempt status of organizations it deems to be terrorist supporting. So these moves are all related and something we're watching closely. So we'll share some related resources in chat for you on this topic. And then lastly, as I transition to our speakers, On the next slide, we just wanted to directly address this so folks have this talking point, because in this environment where there's been a lot of spending cuts, some folks are speculating about to what extent philanthropy can come in and replace those cuts. So we pulled this statistic using candid data. And in some, with the entire federal budget could be funded by private philanthropy in this country for 79 days, and then philanthropy's assets would be gone. If you limit that to just the grant making that federal sources provide to the charitable sector, it would be more like 4.8 years um, of until private philanthropy runs out of assets, which is obviously longer, but still not a sustainable situation. So we just try to stress when we're talking to lawmakers and others that private philanthropy has a role to play right now, but cannot stand in the gap with these massive federal cuts. So finally, on the next slide, and then I will hand it off to our great panelists this morning. Lacey, if you could go to the next slide, please. We want to encourage folks to, despite the complexity of this moment, really lean in and try to make sure you understand the specific rules. We know how tumultuous of a time it is in the sector and how the federal government is scaling back. But the community-based nonprofits that we all work with can help identify gaps and understand where they're emerging in this moment. And folks on the ground will have a unique visibility into the changing landscape. So we need to stay close to them and figure out how to learn from them and apply those lessons in the public sphere. So finally, Lacey, on the next slide, we just want to reiterate, we understand that there are different rules for different folks. And by the end of this training, we hope you'll understand how the different rules apply to your organization and can move boldly ahead. So with that, I'll hand it off first to Maggie, who's going to tackle some of the federal rules for us. Go ahead, Maggie.
Hi, everybody. Great to be with you today. So before I dive into the federal advocacy rules, I do want to offer a disclaimer and apologies for just blatantly reading off of a script for a second, but there's a lot here. So Carrie and I are both attorneys, but we are not your lawyers. So please keep in mind that this is not legal advice. It's purely for educational purposes only. The information contained in this presentation and any attachments is being provided for informational purposes and is not part of an attorney-client relationship. The information is not a substitute for expert legal, tax, or other professional advice tailored to your specific circumstances and may not be relied upon for the purposes of avoiding any penalties that may be imposed under the Internal Revenue Code or state law. And I really do think this is especially important to keep in mind right now because these rules are quite complex. It is a fraught legal environment. And so, I think my one message I hope you all leave with is when in doubt, you have a lot of tools in your toolbox, but it's always good to consult with counsel before using those tools if you have any questions. So with that, I'll move on to the next slide. So very broadly, we are going to be talking about in my section the rules for different types of tax-exempt organizations, how the federal government defines and measures lobbying, how these rules may be applied in practice, and just an overview of permitted activities, exceptions, do's, and don'ts. So on the next slide, just at a very high level, these are rules of thumb for 501c3s generally, but as we'll see throughout today's session, there is some nuance depending on the type of 501c3 at hand. So the big distinction here is largely public charities versus private foundations. And I think there can sometimes be confusion around these distinctions because not all organizations termed foundations are actually private foundations. So for example, community foundations are actually public charities, whereas private foundations are more like, the endowed foundations that Carrie and I work for, MacArthur and Joyce and many others. So the lobbying rules described here and just the rules on this slide most cleanly describe what's applicable to public charities. So many of our grantees, and if there are any community foundations on the call, you as well. And these rules are more permissive than the rules governing private foundations like MacArthur or Joyce. And we'll get more in depth about advocacy, lobbying, and endorsements on the slides to come. But again, if you have any questions, happy to answer at a high level and consult with your counsel as well if you think like specificity is needed. So on the next slide, this, I think, is just a helpful way to think about how the rules apply differently to public charities and private foundations. So all 501c3s are aligned in that it is prohibited, like flat out, to participate in any partisan political activity. So basically, MacArthur couldn't endorse a candidate tomorrow if we wanted to. That would be a violation of our tax exempt status. And, lobbying differs depending on the type of organization you are. For public charities, lobbying is subject to certain limits that we'll discuss in more details. But for private foundations, lobbying at all is subject to excise tax. And in addition to being financially harmful, if there's too much lobbying and too much excise tax, that is actually a risk to a private foundation's tax exemption. So kind of the shorthand to keep in mind is that as a private foundation, lobbying is impermissible. And then for other advocacy, which is a much wider realm that encompasses a lot of really powerful tools. For public charities, access to these tools is really unlimited. That's largely true for private foundations as well, but it's important to keep in mind that there are voter registration rules that we're not going to get too into the weeds on here, but keep that in mind. And I think it's important to remember that these rules don't exist in a vacuum. So even though public charities have more leeway than private foundations do, public charities often receive a lot of funding from private foundations. So, private foundation rules track as their money is allocated, essentially. So it's important to keep in mind that, once a public charity receives private foundation dollars, it's not necessarily, public charity rules apply to that money. And we'll talk more about how the grant making dynamics may impact the rules that apply to any specific grant. So on to the next slide. There are two tests that the federal government uses to, think about and measure lobbying. The default is the insubstantial part test, which basically is a bit nebulous, but it says that if an organization is spending about 3 to 5% of its paid and unpaid activities on lobbying, it's in the clear. But there's not a ton of certainty in these definitions or these numbers, which is why many public charities that know they'll be engaging in some lobbying file a 501h election. And this is a one-time election, and it provides a lot more certainty and comfort, which, as a lawyer, I'm biased, but I love really a black and white set of rules as opposed to a more nebulous definition. And so basically under 501h, there are formulas based on the organization's overall budget that really specifically, like to the dollar, tell an organization how much they can spend on lobbying. And the definitions of what lobbying is are also clearer under 501h. So many of your grantees who contemplate lobbying may have filed this election, and that gives them, more leash to operate, essentially. So on to the next slide. As I mentioned, the definitions for lobbying under the insubstantial part test are somewhat vague, but I think broadly, the underlying idea is that if an organization is contacting legislators to propose, support, or oppose legislation or the government's budget process, that is lobbying. And that also includes urging the public to do the same. So even if it's indirect, it is still lobbying. And it's important to keep in mind as well that lobbying in this construct applies to ballot initiatives as well, as it's essentially a more democratized legislative process. So for the 501h election, on the next slide, the definition is slightly different. So there are two subtypes of lobbying in this framework. There's direct lobbying and there's grassroots lobbying. Both types of lobbying involve communication that expresses a view about specific legislation. But really, the audience is what differs here. For direct lobbying, the audience must be a legislator or, in some circumstances, an executive branch member who participates in the formulation of legislation. But for grassroots, it's essentially anybody else. So when thinking about these frameworks, it's important to keep in mind that, legislators are not administrative bodies, so school boards or housing authorities are not legislators. And similarly, any executive branch officials or bodies are not legislators unless they are specifically engaged in the formulation of legislation, as I mentioned earlier. So, for example, by and large, communication with like the IRS or the EPA wouldn't be lobbying. And for grassroots lobbying, there's also an added element that's really important to keep in mind, and that's the call to action. So basically, what that says is if you're communicating with the public about legislation, you must also have a message along the lines of, contact your legislator to tell them how you feel or something like that in order for that communication to be classified as lobbying. So there's an extra hurdle there, essentially. So on the next slide, there is really an overview of how these rules apply differently depending on different tax classifications under 501c. So as mentioned, there is an important distinction between 501c3 private foundations and public charities. And then, of course, there are other 501c3 or 501c entities, including 501c4 social welfare organizations, which, they're slightly less tax favored than, 501c3s, but they also have more ability to, get engaged in the lobbying process. They are able to lobby as much as they want, and they can also do the electoral activities that are flatly prohibited for 501c3s as part of a like secondary group of activities that they conduct. And I think Carrie wanted to add something here as well.
Sure, thanks, Maggie. For grant makers who are at private foundations, I think it's especially important to keep in mind that our grantees may not realize that these rules differ and that we're under stricter rules than our colleagues at community foundations. So it's important not only for us to understand the rules, but to make sure that our grantees and partners are aware as well, so they understand what we can or cannot do or support. So I know Maggie and I have had these conversations, and Holly as well with various partners. But I just want to stress that it's important not only for us to understand these differences, but to help our grantee partners as well. Thanks, Maggie. Back to you.
Thanks, Carrie. So on that note, we'll go to the next slide. So basically, this is just an overview of what we've been discussing about how the distinction between different types of foundations like has different implications in the lobbying regime. So community foundations can lobby subject to some limits, whereas private foundations should not lobby, but still have a lot of tools and resources they are able to utilize. And we'll get more into the weeds about what those are very shortly. So next slide. This is just a quick run through of the type of activities that any foundation, regardless of its 509A classification as a public charity or private foundation, can engage in. So I think really the rule of thumb here is remembering that lobbying is focused pretty strictly on the legislative process. And there's a wide range of activities outside of and beyond the legislative process where 501c3s are able to act. So for example, if legislation becomes a law, you can engage with what it looks like to actually implement that law. So you can work with the agency in charge of, promulgating regulations and things like that to make sure that it's applied equitably and in line with the causes you care about. You can also fund litigation if you believe that a law is unjust or should be conceptualized differently in courts. Again, that is outside of legislative process. And then separately, there are activities that are entirely removed from legislation. So as Holly mentioned, there has been an absolute flood of executive orders over the past year plus, and it is completely allowed and appropriate to take a stand on those executive orders to the extent, that's mission aligned for you. So on the next slide, There are some really important exceptions to keep in mind here. You know, private foundations are not allowed to lobby. Public charities are allowed to lobby only a small amount, but you can communicate with legislators in specific settings. So, for example, if you're doing nonpartisan analysis or study, that is completely acceptable, as is, if the government reaches out to you for technical assistance because of, expertise you have, you are fully allowed to engage with whoever contacts you, to answer the questions that they may have. You can also just broadly examine social issues. So, if there's a certain law that's touching on, environmental issues, you can publish a paper broadly about the environmental issues implicated, even if you're not talking about the underlying law. Also, very importantly in the current moment is the self-defense exception. So basically, under the self-defense exception, an organization is allowed to lobby to the extent that the law in question or the legislation in question could affect the organization's existence, powers, duties, tax exempt status, or deductibility of contributions. As the sector is under increased attack, this is, I think, top of mind for a lot of organizations. So, for example, the legislation Holly mentioned that essentially would allow Treasury to unilaterally revoke C3 status. That is an example where if an organization wanted to lobby, they may be able to, because it cuts to the core of organizations' ability to do the work they're designed to do and maintain their tax status. But it is important to remember that this is somewhat narrow. So again, using the environmental example, let's say your foundation really cares about environmental issues and there's a really harmful law in Congress, or legislation in Congress designed to, claw back protections. Unfortunately, lobbying against that legislation is not permissible because it doesn't really cut to the inherent core of your organization's ability to work. It's not like considered existential in the same way that something that could revoke C3 status would be. And then again, if you take a stand on executive order, that is outside of the legislative process and that is not subject to these laws. So the next slides, I will really get into what it looks like to apply these rules in practice in the grant making context. So it's important to remember that, of course, private foundations cannot fund lobbying because they themselves are not allowed to lobby, but private foundations can fund organizations that lobby. It's just important to make sure that the structuring is, well thought out in advance, and there are some grant making structures that can be helpful in this case. So on the next slide, we talk about the first one of those, structures that you can utilize, and that's just a general operating grant. This is permitted only for C3 public charities and equivalents, in line with how I think we all think about general operating more broadly. And there shouldn't be any explicit or implicit earmarking for any purpose, including lobbying. And it's really important, as it is the case with all gen op grants, to carry kind of this non-earmarking construct all the way through to the end of the grant. So reporting shouldn't require tracing of how grants funds were spent. There shouldn't be any discussions behind the scenes about like, oh, we would love it if you funded this line of work with, our grant, even though it's not technically earmarked. I think it's really important, especially in the lobbying context, but in all contexts, to respect this framework in order to successfully use this tool. Next is non-lobbying projects. I think this is hopefully somewhat obvious, but basically, let's say you want to fund an organization that has a project that does some lobbying, and then it also has this completely separate project that exclusively does research on a topic you care about. You are fully permitted to fund, the research project, and, just under the understanding that lobbying wouldn't be implicated because they're not doing lobbying in that line of work. But it's really important to make sure that this is clear in your documentation and your discussions. You don't want, any indication that any funding was misallocated toward lobbying. And, I think an important thing here, for example, is that the grant agreement expressly prohibits any use of funds toward lobbying. And it's also important when you're getting reporting back to make sure that the grantee has actually, lived up to the terms of its grant agreement by not lobbying with funds that you did not contemplate to be used for lobbying. Finally, this is the most technical rule, and I'm a visual learner, so it was hard for me to kind of grasp in the abstract until I really saw what these budgets look like. So completely understand if this feels a bit abstract, but I've linked in this slide a resource from Boulder Advocacy, which is really helpful. And I think there's some good resources out there to just see this and practice better. So basically, you are actually allowed to fund projects that may include some lobbying, so long as the amount of your grant does not exceed the project's total non-lobbying budget. And that budget must clearly segregate lobbying and non-lobbying costs for purposes of doing this analysis. And of course, foundation funds can't be earmarked either explicitly or implicitly for lobbying in this construct. And again, like with the last slides, the oversight and reporting should really track back to this structure. So basically, you know, your funds should track against the you should see progress on the full project budget rather than tracing dollars to specific expense lines. So again, I know that's like a bit complicated to just explain via bullet points, but it's a really helpful tool for sophisticated grantees that are engaged in lobbying who you want to support. So with that, I will turn it back to Holly.
Thanks, Maggie. I'm going to quickly touch on state and local rules, mostly to make sure folks in the room from private foundations understand the key differences, because we understand most of you are not engaging in state and local lobbying because you're private foundations, but it might be important for you to have an eye on how the state and city of Chicago approach this topic for public charities so that you can support your grantees and be aware of how they're complying or not complying and make sure they have good information. So to that end, I do want to point out Forefront has a detailed landing page on our website that I just put in chat around federal, state, and local lobbying rules. So that's a resource that's always there for you to send to folks that may need it. The key difference when we're talking about the difference between federal and state rules and how the two levels of government define lobbying is that Illinois, the state definition of lobbying, which is in the Lobbyist Registration Act in ILCS, is very expansive compared to the federal government. So it potentially captures more activity than the IRS would in terms of how they define lobbying. So it's important for folks that are operating in Illinois with potentially lobbying the state to understand that the state has a very broad definition of lobbying. In contrast, the city of Chicago, on this slide, the thing I wanted to highlight is that the city has its own system for regulating those that lobby the city specifically, which is different than the state's rules. And the city of Chicago codified some exceptions and exemptions and thresholds that are very favorable to the public charity sector. And so if you are working with folks that are navigating at the state or city of Chicago level, we can certainly help them understand the boundaries. And importantly, for private philanthropy, the city also codified protections that allow private foundations to engage with the city. Historically, for example, there are foundations that have paid for a position inside city government. And that kind of public-private partnership is protected in the city ordinance that went into effect in mid-2004. And Forefront was heavily involved in negotiating the city ordinances, and some of you in the room were as well. So if you have questions, we can help provide some TA there. So moving along here, on the next slide, this is just a summary of the difference and the exceptions available to the charitable sector that might help when you're navigating at each level. I understand also there's a couple questions in chat. So it looks like Maggie's been able to address Mary's question. I don't know if you want to chime in verbally, Maggie, or if you have a follow-up, Mary. And then there's also a question from Stephanie about DAFs. And we may need Stephanie to expand on her question a little bit to make sure we answer it, but I'll pause to see if there's any follow-up from Mary or Stephanie.
It's Mary. Thank you, Maggie. I think I appreciate your response. I think in the old days, you're right. Might have been easier than it is today. So thank you.
And just to, MacArthur doesn't, we would make some grants to DAFs. We don't have any of our own DAFs, but I'm happy to just share, I think, my understanding. And Carrie, please jump in if your understanding differs. So it's my understanding DAFs are, held at 501c3 public charities. So in a vacuum, the public charity rules would apply. But to the extent a private foundation is making a grant to a DAF, the same granting rules that we discussed earlier should be considered. But I think DAFs are their own can of worms in many ways. So I think this is another great example of where having counsel really dive into the specifics of your situation is incredibly useful, especially as I mentioned in my comment to Mary, in a moment where I think all of us just need to be especially careful. We are crossing our T's and dotting our I's.
Yeah, I appreciate the question on DAFs. It's something that we probably need to specifically add to this training. So let me take a minute and see if I can dig up a helpful resource while we hand it off to Carrie for the next portion. And then I'll also note, I'm going to share in chat, Forefront, in addition to this annual training for private foundations, also does a public charity training that's specific around the rules for public charities. So in chat, you'll find the recording of that most recent training, which is on our YouTube channel, and you all can share that with folks that may need to review the rules for public charities. And with that, we'll hand it over to Carrie to talk about the application of these rules and how it works at Joyce. Thanks, Carrie.
Thanks so much, Holly. Hey, everyone. Great to be with you today. I want to talk a little bit about what this looks like in practice, because I know Maggie and Holly just ran through a lot of rules, and there are naturally questions that come up. And oftentimes, all of those rules can be a bit intimidating, and funders may feel concerned about, okay, what is it that we can do, given that we have all these rules we have to operate under? And I want to share some examples from my experience at the Joyce Foundation on just what it looks like to do this advocacy in practice. So, Joyce is a private foundation. We're under the strictest parameters as a private foundation. Yet, our foundation is focused on doing policy work, specifically in those safe zones that Maggie described. And I love this visual because a lot of times when people hear policy, what they think of is lobbying. And lobbying is just one piece of policy. There's actually a whole lot more. And we like to think of it in terms of this spectrum. And we're going to walk through each of those. But this is the full range of what policy work looks like, from research and development to building support to seeing something all the way through. It's really much bigger than just lobbying. And all of this stuff that's on this screen are all safe things that we can do. And I want to kind of walk through a few examples in each of these buckets. Next slide, please. So the first of these starts with the building blocks of policy. So policy isn't just something that you pluck out of thin air. It takes time to develop, and at least good policy should be thought through. This can include a wide variety of research and analysis to better understand a problem and to think about how to develop possible solutions. So, for example, public opinion research to understand an emerging problem. And a good example here is back in 2021, after January 6th happened, which was a jarring moment for many of us. One of the questions we had was like, okay, what does the public think of this emerging political violence that we're seeing? Do they want government to act? Who do they want to act? What types of guardrails might they support? And we funded some, along with two partner funders that co-funded some research with us to try to understand how the public was perceiving that moment and what they expected government to do about it and where there was support for possible reforms. And that helped us diagnose and better understand a problem, as well as design and test some possible solutions. This had nothing to do with lobbying. This was just the building blocks of how you decide how to combat a problem. That's all safe work. Next slide, please. Oops, and it looks like the slides are out of order. That's not supposed to be there. So let's jump to the next one. All right, so the second stage is policy adoption. So here you've diagnosed the problem, you've identified some possible solutions to it. How do you build support? And this falls in that safe zone again. It's public education, it's coalition building, it's advocacy. It's basically everything short of lobbying. And as funders, we can utilize all of these tools. We can hold convenings. We can support grantees to publish reports on that research they found about the extent of a problem. We can support community engagement to develop that kind of momentum for change and broad support for change. It's everything short of those lobbying definitions that Maggie talked about. So it's not talking about specific legislation. It's not supporting or opposing it. It's not a call to action. It's short of lobbying, but this space of public education and community organizing is in that safe space as long as you're not crossing that line into grassroots lobbying. Next slide, please. This one I think we often forget about is that your work doesn't stop once a policy has been adopted. So whether a policy happens because the legislature passes a bill that the governor signs into law, whether it's an executive agency that adopts new rules or practices, or other policy changes that happen, your work isn't done. You have to make sure that those changes are fully realized. And that implementation support is often really important because there are lots of examples out there of policies that have been passed but don't actually fully realize the change that we're aiming for. And there are lots of ways we can engage in this. One of these would be technical assistance. So, an example from one of our neighboring states, Michigan passed a really large and major redistricting reform several years ago that created an independent redistricting commission. So they took it away from politicians in the legislature and said, we're going to have this independent commission that draws new districts that have to follow rules. We're making it more fair and responsive to actual communities. But they had to set up this entire brand new government process and entity from scratch. And weren't always sure where to start. So we engaged with folks who had been part of those commissions in other states like California and helped bring them in to provide technical assistance and guidance to the folks in Michigan on how do you even go about creating this? What pitfalls should we avoid? What processes do you need? What speed bumps might there be along the way? Having that sort of technical assistance proved really valuable as the state was trying to figure out how to create and implement this brand new process. That's perfectly okay. It's also useful to educate the public on what changes are happening. So recently in Chicago, we moved from an appointed school board to an elected school board. That was brand new, and the public had to understand, why are these people showing up on my ballot? How do we even think about evaluating them? What are the qualifications that we should be looking for? And it was really important to educate the public on what this change was and why it mattered to them. And then finally, in this, doing some accountability. We've got to make sure that new policies are implemented correctly. Sometimes there are government entities that don't like a policy and decide they don't want to enforce it. And then litigation might be needed to make that actually happen. Um, there may be reports, journalist outlets that are doing coverage of like, why isn't this happening? All of these are part of implementation to make sure policy change is fully realized. This is all safe for us to support. Next slide, please. And then the final piece of the puzzle is trying to understand all this. So, doing evaluations, doing case studies to understand, okay, how did this work? What did we learn from it? Are there any insights or lessons learned that should inform future work? So, we discovered this policy was really impactful, but only for some communities and not others. So we really need to tweak it to make sure that it's really encompassing change for everyone. It's also if we find good policies or practices that are implemented, say, in one municipality or one county, sharing that so that others might learn from it as well. And this is how we can really grow the impact of that work. So, like one of my favorite examples here, several of our grantee partners, including Chicago Votes and Chicago Lawyers Committee, were involved in the Cook County Jail voter engagement work. And not only were they doing education on voter registration and the voting process, but Cook County Jail actually got a policy change so that the Cook County Jail could have an early voting site on site there at the jail so that people who were being held who were eligible to vote could still cast their ballot. It was a wildly successful program, and they've been sharing those examples and case studies for other jurisdictions. And I mean, we've seen this expand not only to other parts of Illinois, but they've shared this with other states. Like there's a county in Texas that's trying to replicate this. So we want to make sure that we're sharing these good policy examples as well, so that they can seed good ideas elsewhere. Next slide. Which brings us back to this full picture. This is the full range of what policy and advocacy work can look like, even if you're at a private foundation who are under the strictest rules. We can't do lobbying, but we can do everything else. And really knowing these rules, I like to think of as being empowering, because once you know what the rules are, you're more comfortable being able to do those safely so that we can really maximize our impact while staying compliant. Excuse me, next slide. Um, I know many of us on the call worked on the census last time around. This is another example of like where we can engage and have this advocacy and practice. Census is run through the executive branch, not through the legislature, although there are a couple of things that Congress does have to approve along the way. But census engagement is a safe space for all of us to come together and work in support of democracy. Um, Holly, I don't know if you wanted to add anything or drop in the chat, but this is something that we're all getting really motivated for and ready to go heading into the next census in 2030. Forefront and Joyce co-hosted kind of an initial meeting for funders back in November on this, and there will be more coming soon as we're getting ourselves organized to advocate for a full and complete census for the next time around. Holly, was there anything you wanted to add or no?
No, that's good for now. I'll put a link in chat for our April 1st statewide census kickoff. And then there's much more to talk about with that. So we'll dig in at that event. And if folks have questions about it today, feel free to ask. But for now, we'll move on for the sake of time. Thanks, Carrie.
Sounds good. Thanks. And the next one, just you can see this when you get the slides later, it just has some examples of the impact that the census has, why it matters to different aspects of our sector. And I'll hand it back to Holly.
So we wanted to quickly provide two specific to Illinois examples of advocacy and practice with private foundations engaging. So on this slide, you see this is a photo of some private foundation leaders that met with Senator Dick Durbin at Impact House, where our office is in Chicago, last June. And this meeting occurred right before the final passage of HR 1, which was the tax reconciliation bill from last year. And in order for folks to engage and be in compliance with rules at this meeting, Forefront's team worked with Senator Durbin's staff to have them issue an invitation letter to everybody from the private foundation world that attended this meeting, specifically inviting them to come to the meeting and share their expertise. So that was one way that we could protect folks. And Forefront's always happy to do that when it's helpful. So if you're ever in that position and need support getting that kind of formal invitation, you can reach out. And then on the next slide, you all may remember this ran as a full page ad in the Chicago Tribune recently. Is it a letter that was directed to the general public, and it didn't reference legislation. It critiqued executive action, which, as we've covered earlier, is permissible. And several private foundation leaders signed this letter in solidarity with other business and community leaders. So this is another local example of private foundations weighing in on timely issues in a way that was not out of compliance with rules. So we just wanted to share those two examples for you as you continue to think about what you can do on your end. So in summary, we just want to draw your attention back to like how to think about your role versus your grantee's role. And we think that private foundations can do a lot to support the engagement of their grantees, and not just financially, but also in helping them develop their muscle and their compliance with rules and their understanding of the rules. And so many of these points have already been covered. We don't need to belabor them, but it's just a summary of what we just covered. And anytime you need more support, you can reach out. So for the sake of time, we'll keep moving. I'm going to hand it back to Carrie to go over some unique election year dynamics. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Holly. And folks, you will get the slides afterwards. So we're going to try to move through this quickly, but you'll be able to look back at this at your convenience. So obviously, the sector's advocacy and engagement doesn't just stop because it's an election year, but it does mean we have to be mindful of what rules apply. And this includes rules that nonprofits have to follow around supporting voter engagement and how we engage with public officials. And we're going to walk through each of these topics about why it's important, knowing the rules, staying nonpartisan, being mindful of appearance, as well as some do's and don'ts. Next slide, please. Lacey, can you move to the next? Thank you so much. Nope, one back. Thank you. Perfect. Thanks. So I want to start with why it's important to support election year engagement. So many of us fund grantee organizations that have voter education, voter engagement as part of their work. But I really want to stress why this is important. And I think people often forget about this, or folks are afraid that being engaged during election cycles or supporting nonpartisan voter education work might be perceived as partisan. But it's absolutely vital that we have nonprofit, nonpartisan voter engagement happening because nonprofits have a very different interest here. For political campaigns, they're often the key mechanism through which voters are contacted and encouraged to vote. But the problem is that those campaigns are not durable, long-term, or community-based structure. They are formed with a clear end goal to elect someone. And once that person is elected, the campaigns disappear and don't re-engage voters. And because they need to be efficient with their dollars, campaigns focus on contacting likely voters or people who have voted in the past. And that leads to this cycle where if you're a first-time voter or an infrequent voter, the campaign really isn't incentivized to reach out. And this creates a negative feedback loop that has real consequences. It reinforces the inequities that plague so many of our social challenges. But there's also an opportunity because if we can find ways to reach these new voters, we know that once someone has voted, it puts them in a much better position to become a lifelong voter. Nonprofits are far more likely to focus on reaching those people, those eligible voters that campaigns overlook, who may be brand new. They may be new citizens. They may be someone who just turned 18. They may be folks that are infrequent voters that don't only show up every 4 years. And by really contacting those folks, that's how we break this feedback loop that's you see on the graphic here on the screen. Next slide, thank you. Um, I also want to stress why it's important the other reason it's important to do this um, is that unfortunately there aren't enough nonprofits involved in voter engagement, and there's not enough of philanthropy that are investing in voter engagement. According to some research by one of our colleagues in the field, less than 1% of philanthropic dollars support voter engagement activities, which for all the influence we know that nonprofits have to encourage people to participate at the community level, this work is severely under-resourced, and at a time when barriers to voting are rising, this support is deeply needed. So strongly encourage you to consider that as part of your plans for this year. Next slide. Number one rule, any voter engagement, any work with public officials during an election cycle, number one rule, keep it nonpartisan. This applies to all 501c3s, whether you're a public charity, a private charity, other organizations that are nonprofits. We want to make sure that people stay nonpartisan and, importantly, not just pay lip service to it. I mean, I'm sure we've all been in rooms where someone said, well, technically we're not partisan, but no, we've got to really mean this, and especially at a time when the sector is under a lot of scrutiny, we need to pay attention to that. Second rule, next slide, please. Appearances matter. Some activities, some things that are not permissible in an election year that otherwise would be. And we're going to walk through quickly hit some specific examples. So next slide. There are specific rules regarding voter registration, and this is where we see a difference between community foundations and private foundations. So first, if a nonprofit is doing voter registration, it has to be open to everyone regardless of party. They can't walk around with a clipboard or a tablet only asking people who they're going to vote for and then registering them. You've got to do it equally to everybody. Community foundations are free to support and conduct nonpartisan voter registration drives. Private foundations have really narrow rules. So we can only support voter registration by a grantee if it happens in 5 or more states and across multiple election cycles. And I want to be clear that a primary and a general are considered the same election cycle. So, for example, I'm not able to fund a grantee in Illinois that is doing voter registration this year only. That is not allowed. But if I was funding 6 Midwestern states that are doing voter reg for the next 2 or 3 years, that would fall within this exception. In addition, nonprofits can use general support grants for nonpartisan voter registration, even if it's from a private foundation. So if we give a grant, a general operating grant to an Illinois partner, then obviously it's for their general operations and they decide how to use it. Although, much like Maggie said, with you can't earmark it for lobbying, you can't earmark it for an impermissible purpose here too. Next slide. Regarding voter education and get out the vote, this is definitely something that nonprofits can do, again, as long as it's nonpartisan. Both community foundations and private foundations can support it. We do need to be careful about ballot measures. And I know this issue came up and the question came up in the chat earlier. Nonprofit organizations, so our grantees, they are allowed to work on ballot issues. Community foundations are also allowed to work on ballot issues and fund them. Private foundations cannot. And this is because the IRS has determined that ballot measures are considered lobbying. And the voters are being asked to decide on a policy rather than the legislature. So private foundations are not able to engage in ballot measures. Next up, we want to just stress a few other things about activities that are not permitted. So voter engagement, this cannot openly support or oppose a candidate. So we've got to stay nonpartisan, but that also includes you cannot endorse a candidate for an ostensibly nonpartisan office. So if someone is running for judge, even though that's considered nonpartisan, you still cannot endorse. So that applies to any candidates. Voter engagement also cannot support or oppose any political party. And we also want to be mindful of those appearances. And there's some actions that, we might be okay or softer in normal settings, but are a little more dubious during the election context. So you don't want to give the appearance of supporting or opposing a specific candidate or party. So that would include only inviting certain candidates to participate in a public event. So say you're having a public event, you have a whole lineup of speakers. Well, we're going to feature and invite this person who's running for office, but we're not going to select their opponents to join. No, that is something that could give the appearance of support in an election year, so you need to be more cautious. Similarly, we need to be very cautious and mindful, especially in this current environment, about written publications or communications that might imply support for someone who is currently a candidate running for office. So we just need to have that extra ounce of caution this year. Next up. I think this probably goes without saying for most of us, but we just want to stress 501c3 organizations also cannot give candidates money, so you can't donate to their campaign. That includes if you're going to a fundraiser event, you cannot do that on the official dime. That said, employees of C3s, they are permitted to do this on their own time with their own money. It's considered free speech, but obviously the nonprofit employer would not be able to reimburse that. And there are also some special rules that apply if that nonprofit employee happens to be a registered lobbyist. And then finally, last slide. Much like I said before about the lobbying rules, especially here too with election year considerations, we really need to help make sure our grantees understand this. Before joining the Joyce Foundation, I was a Joyce grantee. I led a nonprofit organization that had a C3 and a C4. And I didn't have a clear understanding at the time that there were these different rules for private foundations versus public foundations. And I think it's really incumbent on us to help make sure that our grantees understand these rules. So why a public charity like a community foundation can support voter registration, but a project grant from a private foundation could not. I think it's really helpful, especially in such a fraud environment, to consider offering training on a periodic basis to our grantees. There's some fantastic resources available from Boulder Advocacy and Nonprofit Vote. But think about, does your foundation want to make available on a voluntary basis trainings every year, every couple of years to your grantees? When you have staff turnover, so your grantee has a new development director that you're working with for the first time on a grant, make sure you take a few minutes to kind of walk them through and make sure they understand the rules that you're under so that both of us, the grantee and the grantor, are able to make sure that we stay in compliance. And I think in this environment, we especially want to be cautious of that. And I will hand the mic back over to Sebastian.
I'm going to chime in quickly and then hand it to Sebastian. I think we got our notes a little mixed up there, but no worries. So moving forward here, we just want to give you some concrete resources, and then we should have plenty of time for questions. So just as we wrap up here, we just want to, some of these things are redundant to issues that have already been covered, but we really want to stress the second point, which is that civic engagement is not lobbying. So when you're engaging as an individual in your own time and you're not representing your place of employment, you're just being a citizen in our democracy, and you can do that freely. I do think I know some folks in the room that work at private foundations are very cautious about using a separate email address or making things like very separate for the work they do on their own time, and making sure you're not getting, campaign newsletters at work and things like that. So it's important to keep your personal and professional lives very separate, but you can and should freely engage as a citizen in our democracy. And on the next slide, we want to stress here too that part of why Forefront exists is to represent you. So when and if you do need to engage or you want to nudge us to use our voice on your behalf, we can talk about how the sector is being impacted by policies, and we can talk about the concerns that we're hearing from folks in the field, because Forefront is allowed to lobby and can talk about the impact without having to be concerned about penalties. And Sebastian Lacey and I are all registered lobbyists, and we submit our expenses on the 990 and comply with all of the rules, and that allows us to engage freely. And then on the next slide, here's just a summary of ways we've seen folks responding in this moment. And what I want to encourage folks to do is make sure you're signed up for our weekly member briefings if you're an active member. Actually, as Sebastian said, more like bi-weekly in 26. But those are good, safe spaces where we can talk about issues. Those are unrecorded meetings where you can come and ask questions and trade notes. And then moving forward quickly, we wanted to share the National Council of Nonprofits is running an actual like proactive ad campaign to talk about the value of the nonprofit sector. Since in this moment, we're kind of all on our heels and having to defend ourselves against negative attacks about our work. So they've tried to move into proactive mode on this and actually are funding an ad campaign. And to do that, they tested some messages. So on the next slide, we wanted to share these are some of the messages that their research found actually increase support and move folks that are polled on the value of the nonprofit sector. So not only can you use these kinds of effective messages when you're talking about your work and coaching your grantees about how to talk about their work, but you could also fund communications work that is research-based in some ways to help cultivate more support for the charitable sector. So we just wanted to lift that up, and these are resources we can link you to directly. But we're hearing a lot from the field that communication support is a huge need right now. Folks are really grappling with how to talk about their work in effective ways and without drawing, negative scrutiny. So we understand that's a real need and just wanted to lift that up. And with that, I'll hand it over to Sebastian to wrap us up, and then we'll take questions.
Thank you, Holly, and thanks everyone for being here again. Some additional resources that were already sort of covered throughout the presentation as well. Boulder Advocacy was mentioned quite a bit during the past hour. It's a great resource. You can see their one pager right there, sort of highlights Illinois specifically. They do have a hotline as well. If folks are ever interested in or have questions on how to go about interacting with elected officials. They have an email address as well that can be contacted. Additionally, Illinois has additional contact information as well. The Secretary of State's office has a lobbyist email address you can contact with additional questions for state and local lobbying efforts and how to interact with lawmakers. And then Chicago has its own email address as well for the city if you're based or within the city of Chicago. And then we have some additional resources as well that we can drop for you guys to be aware of. But I think ultimately Boulder Advocacy was a good resource that folks brought up the past hour. Additionally, as the spring session kicks off in Springfield and Congress continues to be Congress, we have our policy agendas here at Forefront. If you're curious on what we're doing, feel free to sign up for our policy alerts. Those are alerts to go straight to your inbox on bills at the state, local, or federal level that might impact the sector or the work that you guys all do. So you can scan a QR code to sign up for those alerts. And we do intend to send those out pretty regularly throughout the spring, throughout the year, as bills advance in the legislative process at any three levels of government. Yeah, the next slide. Another QR code, this one's in orange, it's a little bit prettier. But we have events coming up as well. We have, as mentioned earlier, the April 1st Texas statewide kickoff event that I expect to see all of you up because it's also Lacey's birthday. So you have two incentives on why you should go to that event. And also, as Holly mentioned, we have our bi-weekly member briefings where we understand folks can't keep up with all the news going on an everyday basis. So we try to provide a good snapshot as well as guest speakers, what's going on in Springfield, in Illinois, in Washington, so that folks can be fully briefed on what's happening with all of everything coming in, breaking news. Next slide. And then we are gearing up for Foundations on the Hill, which is happening March 16th through 19th in Washington, D.C. These are photos from previous years. I'm going to push Holly for us to do another, or for us to get an elevator photo. That looks pretty fun. But if you haven't registered, registration is still open. There's still an early bird registration as well until, I believe, February 27th for early bird registration. And this is a great way for folks, for foundations to communicate with their members of Congress, specifically in Illinois, are 17 House members and 2 U.S. senators, and 4 of us taking the lead as the state delegate to help structure this and provide logistics and connect folks with their federal officials. So we'll be in DC on those days. It's still not closed, so feel free to look at the links in the chat to register and learn more about what we will be doing in DC. And then lastly, contact information. Holly, myself, and Lacey's email addresses are right there. And we also have a general public policy inbox. So feel free to contact us with any questions regards to this training, additional resources that Forefront offers, and any other areas that we can help address that might come up either today, the rest of the week, or anytime in the rest of the year. And with that, we have time for questions.
Any questions for our panelists? Anything we missed? Go ahead, Mary. I saw you come off mute, so I assume you
I
have
did.
questions.
I just like to come off mute at the Q&A because I like to say, thank you, everybody. I appreciate it. More of a comment. Really appreciate this. I've done it before, of course, but great to have a refresher, particularly in this moment in time as we all try to lean into what we can do instead of being scared by what we cannot do.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And yes, a huge thanks to Maggie and Carrie. Emily has shared an evaluation link in chat. It is anonymous. It's quick, so we appreciate your feedback. And I'm going to ask Emily to go ahead and turn off the recording and conclude the event, and then we'll stay behind for any questions that folks would like to ask once the recording is off. Thank you all.
Thanks so much.